everyone. Welcome back to this new episode of the Venture Podcast. We're so excited to be joined here by Philip Johnston. Philip is the CEO of Lumen Orbit, and this is likely one of the coolest companies we've ever interviewed on this podcast. They're out of this world, literally. They're putting data centers into space. They're powering them with 4-kilometer squared solar panels, and they're one of the first companies ever to do it. They're just fresh off their $11 million seed round. They were in this recent Y Combinator batch as well, and it's amazing for him to join us. And I believe, James, this is going to be our first episode of 2025. So for everyone who's watching, Happy New Year, and hopefully this is a great start to the 2025.
Awesome. Well, with that being said, Philip, we'll just dive into before we get into the real juice of the interview, being Lumen Orbit. Why don't we start by just introducing you and getting a little better sense of who you were growing up. Where did you grow up, Philip, and what kind of person were you as a child? Was there any particular experience or interest that shaped the way you view the world today?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me, James and Bryce. It's cool to be on the podcast. I grew up in South Africa until I was about 5, and then the UK from there until 22, and then moved to the US for grad school, and then all over really since then. So lived more time outside the UK than inside, but consider myself a Brit, definitely. So yeah, I think probably one of the more defining features about my childhood was that I'm an identical twin. I have an identical twin brother, and I'm the youngest of 5 boys. So wow. I don't know if that certainly a bit of healthy rivalry, maybe, should we say.
Philip, you mentioned you're a twin. I also have a twin brother, which made me kind of the person who I am today. I was super competitive with my twin growing up. And you mentioned you were a little bit competitive with yours as well. What do you think that's done for you today as a person? And is your brother also in the tech world, or how does that work?
Is your twin brother identical, if I can ask?
Fraternal.
Okay. So for me, he is in the tech world. We actually have almost identical career paths up until this point. He also founded a climate tech company. Also went through YC the year before me. So yeah, I'd say like healthy competition maybe, because one way of looking at it is competition. The other way is to say it's kind of like I can see the things. If he does something cool, then it can inspire me to try and do something, and same vice versa.
I also have another question. I guess not so much about the twin brother rivalry growing up, but more about the fact that you're from South Africa. You were cutting out when you said that, but is that what you said? You're from South Africa?
I was born in the UK, and then when I was very young, like a baby, like 6 months old, moved to South Africa and stayed there for about 5 years. And then moved back and stayed in the UK till I was about 22. And then since then, I've been all over. I was back in South Africa for a year, 2 years in Singapore, 2 years in Dubai, 2 years in Saudi, 4 years in the US. Yeah, a bunch of different places. A year in
Very cool. That's awesome. James and I, before our call, one thing that we paid a lot of attention to is your white paper, and we have a ton of technical questions that we think our viewers would really love to talk about over the course of this call. But one thing that's super important as well, and a huge enabler for your company, is a company like SpaceX and like what Elon Musk is building. What sorts of things do you look up to in the way that he builds his companies? As a fellow, I guess, South African, even if you're not fully born there, have you looked up to him in your entrepreneurial career? And what sorts of things do you try to, I guess, maybe model or look up to him for?
Yes, he is definitely my entrepreneurial idol, shall we say. There's not too many people whose biographies I find the time to read, but I read his. I read the Isaacman biography of him. I think he's obviously like an absurdly good executor. Like that's definitely that's one thing that's obvious. I think what inspires me about him is his ability to way before anybody else can see things, his ability to see clearly a 20-year time horizon, and in some cases a 50-year time horizon or more, and not really to care about how crazy it sounds in the moment, and to think from first principles, because it's all very well being a good executor, but you have to be executing the right stuff. And I think that's what he's really shown time and again that he's incredible at. So yeah, that's what inspired me about him.
And I guess the next question kind of goes back to first principles. When I first, really learned about entrepreneurship and the tech ecosystem in general, um, first principles was a concept that was very new to me. But I quickly realized like this is something that an approach that most people or the best people really take when they want to solve problems. It was even more clear to me when we read your white paper when we started to learn more about your company, because at first glance when you hear data centers, space, huge solar panels, it's like, oh my god, this is crazy. But then when you really think about it, it's like, hold this on a second. From first principles, there's a lot of things that really make this make sense, and it's actually not as crazy as you'd think. um, and it made a lot of sense to us. So I
Mm.
guess, like, could you maybe teach some of our younger viewers, people who are fresh out of university, perhaps exploring entrepreneurship for the first time, what first principles is, and how you really go about solving problems in the simplest possible form before you build it into a complex thing like a startup.
Yeah, sure. First principles, I mean, I actually like applying this first principles thinking in many different areas, not just in engineering, but also in the way business and regulation and everything works. But as an example, in our company, one way to reason is by analogy. So, for example, if you want to know how big the radiator on our satellite is about a quarter the size of the total radiator. So it's about 4 kilometers, 4 square kilometers of radiator. So one way to figure out how much it's going to cost to build a 4 square kilometer radiator is to say, well, what's the biggest radiator currently and how much does it cost per square meter? And then times that by X. So you might look at, for example, the International Space Station. They have the largest space-based radiators right now. They dissipate about 100 kilowatts right now. So you might say, okay, well, let's just size that up. But first principles says you basically start from scratch and you say, well, what needs to be expensive about a radiator? What is a radiator fundamentally? And fundamentally, a radiator is, I mean, you can think even more basic than this, but the way you're thinking about it is two sheets of metal that you pass hot liquid through. That's what a radiator is fundamentally, um, and or tubes or something. That there's nothing inherently expensive about that. So it's really just a case of, can you manufacture this? Can you assemble these atoms in a way that make it cheap? And so that's what we're spending a huge amount of our engineering time working on now is, can we make a low cost, low mass, very large deployable radiator? It turns out we think we have a pretty good design. But yeah, that's what first principles means. It means you don't necessarily reason by analogy. You start from the basic building blocks and you work up.
Before, Philip, we get a little bit more technical on what Lumen Orbit does, I just want to quickly get the story of how this all became. Where did the idea for Lumen Orbit originate from for you guys? How did you assemble this team of co-founders? And I guess before you started the company, you were working at McKinsey in Dubai, working on satellite projects for national space agencies. Did that have a little bit to do of starting your journey with Lumen Orbit?
Yes, definitely. So yeah, I was working with the space agencies of the UAE and Saudi government on various projects. That's definitely where I noticed what was happening in space, and in particular, that the launch cost is coming down very rapidly, um, and that the launch cost is projected to come down maybe 100x, maybe 500x over the next decade. So that the genesis of it for me was, I mean, I'm interested in space anyway. So early last year, I went down to Starbase, Texas, where they are launching the Starship from. Starship is the game changer for all of this, by the way. So without Starship and without, could be New Glenn or another one, but without a fully reusable heavy launch vehicle, none of this will work. So yeah, I went down to Starbase, Texas last year just to have a look around. And what struck me about being there was the capacity they're building for is enormous. So it's not just that it's going to be cheap; it's that they're going to increase the capacity for mass to orbit by about 10,000x. So they're building this Starship Gigafactory. It's designed to churn out 3 Starships a week. It's basically a Tesla production line for Starships. So in 18 months' time, they're saying 3 Starships a week, and then beyond that, up to 3 Starships a day that they're going to be producing. Each Starship has minimum 100 tons payload capacity, maybe 200 tons, and each Starship can fly multiple times a day. So versus the current status quo, which is Falcon 9, it can fly once every 2 weeks, and you have 20 tons payload. It's literally orders of magnitude, and you have to rebuild the upper stage every time you fly. That's what made me notice what's going on in space. Then I spoke with my co-founder Ezra, who's from the same place as me in the UK, and we were discussing various applications of low-cost launch. One of which was space-based solar. So it's not a new concept. Since the 60s, people have been talking about using very large solar panels in space and then somehow getting that energy back to Earth. And the main ways people talk about are either using microwave transmission, so you basically have big microwave receivers and then send power down using microwaves, or you can do it using lasers or other things. The main problem with it is that you have this enormous efficiency loss in terms of the energy you send versus what you receive. So I think it's like 95% efficiency loss. So if you're sending, if you're sending 100 kilowatts, you're only getting 5 kilowatts of energy when you're receiving it. And so then we were looking at it and we were saying, well, what are we going to be using this energy for once we get it to Earth? And it turns out that in sort of 20 years' time, the forecasts are that half of all terrestrial electricity consumption will go into data centers. And so if you can find a cheap way of getting the data center to space, it's much more effective to consume the energy in space processing data than it is to get it down. There's going to be many applications of low-cost launch. Manufacturing is going to be one. Asteroid mining is going to be one. Space tourism, communications. The one you want to start with is the one that has low mass of the product. So the product, when you process data, is bits. So you can send that down to Earth very easily. The product, if you're doing manufacturing in space or if you're doing asteroid mining, for example, is something that you still need to re-enter, and re-entry is relatively expensive. So we're really starting with the first use case of low-cost launch, which is, the first high energy need in space is going to be data processing.
That's very interesting. And how do you view the future? Because I know initially, like the focus for Lumen Orbit, it's largely on training data clusters for training like LLMs or large AI models. I think we're starting to see a shift where there's a lot more inference-based compute going into these systems. How do you view, I guess, the training versus the inference part? I know in your white paper you talked about like laser optical communication as well. How does your strategy, I guess, shift with the speed that AI is moving at, and how do you guys make sure that your data centers are always going to be the out of this world, or the best possible solution?
Yeah, I have on a daily basis. I hear every variant of every space pun you can imagine.
Sorry, I'm going to keep using them.
When is the company going to launch? If you know what I mean. So, yeah, I forgive your space puns.
Thank you.
The end state is training, and that's what we've put in the concept in the white paper. And the reason for that is, it's very important for training clusters that they have very high internal networking, and for that you pretty much do need them to be physically located in the same space, and space is a good place to do that. So the end state is definitely towards training, and it's also where you can drive higher value workloads. In the very short term, we'll be offering edge compute services for other satellites. So you can think of an Earth observation constellation. Let's say they're monitoring wildfires in California. What they do is they're just taking a whole bunch of raw imagery, and then they have to wait for a ground station to downlink that imagery. And there's huge bandwidth constraints from space to Earth, and there's huge latency in doing that. So there are certain satellites that already have optical terminals, and so they can ship large amounts of raw data to us. We can then run some inference workload on that, or there are some applications of doing in orbit fine tuning of models. If you want to detect a new type of threats, let's say, you might want to fine tune a model in space. So that's the first applications. I mean, there's also some data sovereignty use cases. There are certain people who would rather keep their data in space. So yeah, you can drive much higher value from the satellite running those workloads, particularly as launch cost still needs to come down by about 10x for the longer term vision to make sense. So in the interim, in the next 2-3 years, that's what we'll be working on.
For sure. And the data sovereignty piece, and also there's in general geopolitical implications. Like there's a lot of effort going in between a bunch of different countries to get to space first, whether it's satellites, whether it's industrializing it as a whole. Um, what how has this changed anything in your approach? Have you, I guess, maybe seen things that I guess the average person doesn't see when it comes to those geopolitical tensions and data centers and just in general industrializing space as a whole?
There is a very rapid space race going on now. The Chinese have this Starship equivalent called Long March, which is is their sort of low cost launch vehicle. There's a race. I would say the race at the moment is more on, for example, people are very interested in the poles, in the lunar poles, and I think the US is very keen to get there first and probably put some kind of defensive position there. But in terms of also there's the Chinese are building a Starlink equivalent, as are the Europeans. People are worried about relying too heavily, a little bit worried about relying too heavily on Starlink. I think probably the most relevant point though is the US government. So Elon is very opposed to Starlink being used for military purposes. So the US government has contracted SpaceX to build this constellation called Star Shield, which is basically the US government's private network that performs similar tasks to Starlink. And I would imagine many other governments are looking at doing something similar. I think the Taiwanese are keen to do something along those lines. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's just really around novel insights. Because I guess like with this sort of stuff, like it's all ongoing, and a lot of it's very how do I say this? Not non-obvious unless you're looking to learn, I guess, these insights. So it's interesting observation. So thank you. I guess we'll ask one more question, and then James wants to talk a little more about company building. But I guess my last question is, going forward with Lumen Orbit, if you have the ability to have no monetary constraints, if there are no monetary constraints in your way, what would be the next big thing that you'd really want to do with Lumen Orbit? Maybe once you guys accomplish that initial task of creating these huge training data clusters in space with these massive solar panels, what would be next?
I think we've got a handful for at least the next 2 decades, to be honest.
Yeah.
The white paper lays out quite a long-term vision, and I think if we plow ahead at that vision, we'll have more than enough on our plate. My view is that all data centers are going to space. Anything that doesn't require less than 20 millisecond latency will be in space, and that's like trillions of dollars worth of compute and energy that's going to space. I mean, what we're building in terms of the radiator is a product. The radiator is useful for any high energy application in space. So if you want to do manufacturing in space, for example, or if you want to do refining for asteroid mining in space, you do need a way to dissipate the heat in a vacuum. And because you don't have convection or conduction, that's quite challenging. So every space application that uses a lot of energy is going to need a large deployable, low cost, low mass radiator. And so, yeah, I'd say that the technology we're developing on that front is applicable very broadly. I'll say it anyway, but there will be many companies built around building very large, low cost, low mass radiators. Not that I'm trying to encourage anybody to compete with us, but it's a technology that everybody's going to need.
Philip, the next question I want to ask. So Lumen Orbit had one of the most oversubscribed YC raising rounds in history. I believe it was 11 million you guys closed in on your seed round. how do you guys go about navigating this large influx of investors, and ultimately, like, what guided your decision making through this process? Because I imagine it was quite challenging.
Yeah, since then, actually, we've taken quite a lot more capital. So we closed that round in September. We only announced it last week, and then we've had quite a bit of inbound. So yeah, the valuation is more than doubled, and we've taken in a bit more capital. The purpose of that is to ensure that we have the capacity to hit the objectives needed. So in May next year, we're launching our demonstrator satellite that will have the most powerful, well, 100 times more powerful GPU compute than has ever been operated in space before. If for some reason there was to be a failure on that launch, and failures can happen for various reasons, not necessarily in our control, then we wouldn't want to be in a situation where that's our only shot. And so for a hardware company like us, it makes sense to take a little bit more capital so that it gives us some buffer if, in case, so that we can have a second launch, even if there were to be a failure on the first launch. So that's roughly the thinking of the capital.
And how has YC helped you guys throughout your startup experience so far? I mean, this is definitely a unique company to take a chance on. How have they kind of supported you along this process?
Actually, YC's invested in a bunch of companies that are kind of wacky. So they did Astroforge 2 years ago. Astroforge is the only company that I'm aware of that's still trying to do asteroid mining. Yeah, they've done a few space companies: Relativity Space, Stoke Space, Hubble Networks, Astranis, which is a satellite company. So yeah, I wouldn't say we're particularly unique in that regard. They're also, I would say, more friendly or more open to hardware companies in general than they used to be, particularly with this wave of AI. Because if you're not building something pretty cutting edge in AI, then, like, if you're building a standard SaaS product, it's quite likely that you're going to get destroyed by AI soon. And so I think they're branching out a little bit. Where they used to mainly focus on B2B SaaS companies, now they're focusing a lot on frontier, really cutting edge stuff. But YC's been super helpful in general. Like, I can't recommend YC highly enough. Like, the batchmates are great. They put you in a group with other deep tech founders. So, and you have all the, like, group office hours where you set goals, and that helps push you along. And they were helpful with fundraising, and helpful with customers. The advice from partners is helpful. So personally, I'm an extremely huge proponent of YC. We got rejected the first time, so people should apply twice. Like, it's pretty brutal, the acceptance rates.
Looking at your career trajectory, you really have a business background.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious how this has shaped, um, what you can bring to the table for Lumen Orbit, and how has it, like, given you a unique perspective on this project that you're working on now? Because I imagine the people you're working with are, extremely technical engineers. Obviously, you're an engineer too, but with the business background. So I'm just curious as to what that's provided you with.
Yeah, I would definitely point to my co-founders in terms of, like, this idea is not my idea. It's my co-founder's idea, to be frank. We started looking at space-based solar, but I would not have landed on this idea myself. So I give them all credit for that. I think having a technical background helps in being able to assess, what kind of makes sense from a first principles perspective, but it doesn't. It's not a substitute for the experience of being an engineer. So yeah, I mean, my role in the company is on the commercial side of things. So customer contracts, fundraising, and then business building, in terms of, like, legal, HR, finance, all that stuff, all the extremely boring stuff. I mean, no, the customer side of things is very, very interesting. So yeah, that's my value add, is the commercial side and business building. We're quite well split between the three of us. So I do that. My co-founder Ezra, the CTO, he does everything on the satellite bus side of things. So everything that's not the data module, like the high performance GPUs, he's working on the mechanical structure of, like these deployable, the propulsion system and the bus and everything else. And then my co-founder Adi, who comes from a data center background at Microsoft and also from SpaceX, he does everything to do with the data module, so like the payload of the satellite, if you want.
With this new capital, you talked a lot about it being a bit of a safety cushion as well for when you guys need to build a second one of these, or if you need to rebuild it or adjust it in some way. But when it comes to scaling your team, I'm sure that's something that you're looking at now as well, and you're probably
Yeah.
in the process of hiring a bunch of new people. How does the mindset shift occur there, and what sorts of things have you been doing to um, you know maintain acceleration while adding new people, because sometimes it can initially slow you down. How are you going to keep that acceleration going, so you can hit your exit velocity? Sorry, I had to do it again.
Escape velocity, I think you mean. I like it.
Thank you, thank you.
Um, Yeah, I don't want to frame it solely as defensively that raising this capital. I mean, it does help to de-risk it slightly, but it's also definitely an offensive move as well, in that it enables us to hire the best engineers and build the team really quickly and prove this out faster than anybody else could. So yeah, it's definitely an offensive move as well. In terms of building the team, we don't plan on hiring any non-engineers for the first like 10 or 15 hires at least. So our team, I think, is, if we speak in a year's time, I think we'll have one of the most talent dense teams of any organization in the world. Our first hire, Bailey, comes from Helion Energy, which is the most well-funded nuclear fusion startup. Before that, 4 years at SpaceX, and then he was at MIT before that. So he's like absolutely phenomenal engineer. And then we'll be looking to make a couple more hires over the coming months. And then I think quickly scaling to about 10 or 15 engineers before the first launch.
Very cool, very cool. And what sorts of things, I guess, are you working on, or have you've probably already worked on this, because you're the Harvard student body president. You've been to a bunch of the top schools. So I'm sure you've been in many situations where you've managed people or led these teams before. Maybe how have those past experiences helped you, so now you're ready to say, when you do expand this team, you're ready to get them on board quickly and really get them up to speed and get moving a lot faster. Like, what sorts of transferable skills perhaps can you take from your past experiences?
Um, yeah, I would say my skill set is in aligning people towards a common goal. So if you ask me, if I'm being very frank, I would not say I'm the best like COO, in the sense that I don't love the weekly KPI tracking type stuff, which is very important for business and does need to be done, and I will do it. But I would not say it's my forte. But I would say getting a group of people who come from different backgrounds to work together on a single goal is something that I enjoy doing, and that's something I've definitely got better at over time.
Philip, just in the interest of time here, I know we only got a couple minutes left here. One question we like to ask our guests, because we have a bit of a younger audience, is what kind of advice would you give to people who are, say, in university or just starting their careers out, who have dreams and hopes of pursuing a project like Lumen Orbit? What would best set them up to do something like that and be audacious?
Um, the most important thing, and this is not exactly my career path, so it's a bit of a do as I say, not as I do. But it's very important to be as technical as you can be, I would say. I'd say that's probably one of my regrets, is switching out of the technical stuff too early. It's very, very important to be as technical as you can. especially if you want to found a company, especially if you want to found a company now, because like AI can do all of the business stuff pretty well. So AI struggles at the very cutting edge of the engineering side of things, or at least that's the only part at the moment where humans have some kind of edge. So I would encourage people to stay at the very, very front, the very cutting edge. And the other thing is, I think it's easier than people realize to jump to the very leading edge. Like you can get to the front of like agent deployment in AI you can be one of the top 1% knowledgeable people or 0.1% knowledgeable people in the world about agentic deployment of AI agents in about 6 months. Like in about 6 months, you can be, because there's so few people that are good at it and have any experience in it because it's so new, you can get there really quickly. And I would say the same is true of certain aspects of space. Obviously, not on the hardcore engineering side of things, but like you can learn a lot about because low cost launch has been a thing for such a relatively short period of time. There are not that many people that know tons about it, so you can really kind of get up to speed or become an expert or become more knowledgeable than almost anybody quite quickly on it. So yeah, I would say don't be afraid to. And same with humanoid robots. Humanoid robots are going to be like $10 billion or 10 billion humanoid robots within 10 or 15 years. Like if you get in now, you're going to be an expert at something which is going to be massive, and it won't take you very long to get really to the cutting edge of it. So I'd say if you found yourself stuck on a path, don't be afraid to like just switch out of that into something that you can see is growing extremely fast, because you can propel yourself to the cutting edge of that much quicker than you can to the cutting edge of a slow moving technology.
Good advice.
That's great advice. Great advice. Honestly, I think we'll leave it there. We want to be respectful of your time, Philip, and I really appreciate you. Responding to us on LinkedIn, coming onto our podcast. We think you're going to do great things. I like the way that you approach your thinking. And I don't mean this in a weird way, but I feel like there's a lot of like parallels between Elon Musk. I don't know. I just feel that I'm talking between like the first principles thinking.
I'm trying.
You mean it? Like, no, I see it. So it's I think what would be super cool, in all these years, James and I are going to keep this podcast going. We're very consistent with this, and
nice.
We'd love in a few years' time to see where you're at, and maybe have you on for an episode in 2-3 years from now when those data centers are up in space and you're maybe up there with them. That'd be pretty cool.
Awesome. I'd love to. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Philip. We'll let you get back to work, but we greatly appreciate it.